When setting up a soldering iron, the first thing to make sure is that you take out the soldering iron out of the back. Check that the soldering iron is not hot by placing your hand over the top or feeling near the collar. If the soldering iron is not on and not hot, check before you use it that the actual tip is screwed in. Sometimes this collar becomes loose, which then makes the tip of the soldering iron move around. Only tighten the collar when the soldering iron is cold. Once that is done, place the soldering iron in its holder, and then you're able to then take the power lead out of the back of the fan and plug it in at the back. When you plug it in at the back, it needs to be firmly in this joint. The connections sometimes can feel a little bit loose, and when they're stored in the cupboard, if they are plugged in, sometimes they come slightly unplugged. So make sure that's plugged in. Once that is done, the soldering iron's in its cast iron holder, so it's nice and safe. We can then take the cord, ensure that the cord does not have any burn marks or any problems with the casing. Plug this into the power supply. Ensure that the power supply is turned off when you plug it in. Push the cabling down the back of the table. This way it's out of your way and it won't interfere with your soldering. Once you've done that, you need to set the temperature of the soldering iron around about 380 degrees. We'll be using lead-free solder, and you might need to turn it up to about 390. But be very careful that you don't turn it up above 400, otherwise the tip will oxidize very, very quickly. When using a sponge, it's important that you actually use only distilled water on the sponge. So take the dispenser and just squirt the sponge with a bit of water. This will soak into the sponge and make it soft for when the soldering iron needs cleaning. Now, distilled water needs to be used because tap water sometimes can actually carry some particles which could then get into your solder, which then could cause oxidization and rusting within the solder, and if it gets into the joint could actually create a situation where it starts rusting between the solder and the actual metal and stop the bond from occurring, and it's like a cancer that appears between the metal and the actual solder bond, and eventually that could weaken and lose connection. Once you're set up, so we've got the copper ball, we've got our sponge that's been wet now and it's soft now, we've set our temperature, we've already checked our collar, we can then turn the soldering iron on. Now, if it doesn't, or turn it on at power point first, and then you can turn the soldering iron on. On the soldering iron, there is a little red on the main fan area, there is a little red light. This shows you when the temperature of the tip is being increased. So every time this light is on, we're actually sending and heating the tip of the soldering iron up. The fan pulls the flux through when it's been burnt, and will actually take the smoke away and sends out the clean air. So the carbon filter here actually takes all the particles, etc. out. When you solder in front of this extraction fan. Now we're nearly up to temperature, we're waiting for this little red light to actually turn off, and when that turns off we know we're up to temperature. When you're packing it away, it's a good idea that after you've tinned it and you turn it off, that you make sure the soldering iron is cool before you put it back away, especially if you're placing it in the back for long-term storage. Don't expect it to cool down in the cupboard. It could be quite dangerous if you put away a very hot soldering iron. So I always try to turn the soldering iron off first, then I'll pack away all my equipment. By the time all the equipment's packed away and I come back to the soldering iron, it's ready to be put into the cupboard. Now you notice that the pilot light now is flashing down here. This means we're up to temperature. So if I was going to do some soldering, the first thing I'm going to do is take the soldering iron out and then clean that. So I'm using the sponge at the moment. That would temperature shock the tip a little bit. And then, or you can use the ball, which is my preferred method, to actually turn the tip of the soldering iron from a dark color back to silver. So once again, follow this procedure to set up. To pack up, you need to make sure that you tin the soldering iron appropriately. So I'll just get some solder. But before we put it away, how do you know when your soldering iron's the right temperature? Well, the first thing you should do is actually tin the tip. You want to put the solder on there, and you want it to wait about a second before it turns to a liquid. Once again, if I put this in front of the fan, you notice the smoke goes straight into the fan and doesn't come out the top, and that's why we use the extraction fans. When you pack it away, add a surplus of solder to the soldering iron tip, turn the soldering iron off, and just roll the solder around until it cools. It doesn't take long for it to form a ball and coat the tip. Once that's done, place it back into the holder. Like I said before, put your equipment away, and by the time you come back to this should be cooled down enough. At the moment it's not, so I'm very wary of that, so I'm just going to move it to the side at the moment and deal with the power lead. Once you have finished soldering, turn off at the power point and disconnect. Retrieve the cable from behind the cupboard where we placed it before to ensure that it doesn't get in our way. Disconnect the power cord from the back, and then what you need to do is actually roll the lead up into a tight little ball like this. Most of the cables have been done like this before, so they naturally roll into a nice little hand size ball. Roll the cable all the way up, then this will fit nicely into the back and the fan area of the soldering iron. Once you've done that, you can then take both these over and place them into the cupboard together, and that'll ensure that the soldering iron is ready for you for next time.